there, though, because just having notes on this, just knowing where you can get the resources on that, even if you're not a science person, you're going to run into people who are going to go, well, you know, the Bible says this and science says that. And you're going to hear the responses to that from an academic level to where science and faith are complementary. So without any further ado, Fuzz Ron.
Yep.
Okay?
All right, well, it's good to be back here at Anchor House. This is my second time here, and so it's great to be able to be with you guys. And some of you I've met already, some of you I haven't, so this will be a little bit of an introduction about me and about Reasons to Believe. Rick did a great job of describing what Reasons to Believe is about, but our purpose is to open people to the gospel by revealing God in science. And so that's significant because we're not simply focused on here's some really cool scientific evidence for Christianity, but we really are concerned about how do we use that evidence to help people see the truth of the gospel? How can we use that evidence and build a bridge to the gospel? And our vision is to see people from all over the world in every walk of life come to recognize God's attributes in creation, fall in love with Him, and embrace the gospel. That's what we're about. And our strategy at Reasons to Believe is to listen to the questions that people ask or to listen to the objections that people raise about the Christian faith from science and then engage those questions, engage those objections. And we like to talk about the latest discoveries in science. And that's a part of our strategy because people want to know the latest about science or the latest about technology. And if we can talk about that and engage them in a non-threatening way, we can then introduce spiritual ideas that hopefully will lead to deeper conversations that move people closer to the gospel. Right? So,
I'm going to shut these lines.
okay, sure thing.
There's a lot. We're trying to video this, and you're just a black dot.
Oh, I look better if I'm just a black dot on the screen. Okay, so I think Rick also did a good job of, explaining why it's important for you to spend a few days hearing about the relationship between science and the Christian faith, because we live in a world that's dominated by science. It's influenced by technology. We're living in an increasingly secular world in many respects, and people trust science. They trust what technology can deliver. In fact, there are people that really almost put their faith in what science and technology can achieve. So for some people, science and technology almost takes on a bit of a religious role or religious function in that they see science and technology as a means to a type of salvation. This is called techno-faith. That's the technical term for it. Academicians would call it techno-faith. So we have to be able to engage science. And you, by virtue of the fact that you're here at Anchor House, tells me that you either are going to be professionally involved in ministry or you're going to be involved in ministry at a lay level, that you're going to be influential in the church that you attend, that you're going to be a leader, you're going to be a person of influence. And there will be people in your congregations who will struggle with science faith issues. There will be people that you're trying to share your faith with, or people in the congregation you're part of will be trying to share their faith with, and there will be questions and objections involving science. So that's why we're doing this, right? And the goal, as Rick said, isn't to master everything that I'm saying here. In fact, I'm going to really be presenting things at an introductory level, and I'm going to try to introduce to you some core ideas that if you can take those away, then you should be able to know how to respond to people and then where to send people to get more details, or where you can yourself go to get more details as you need that information. So that's what we're going to try to accomplish. Now, how many of you have taken part in a survey right, over the phone, on the internet. Okay, how many people like to do that? How many people don't? Okay, well, for those of you that like to take part in surveys, you're welcome because you just took part in a survey. And for those of you who don't, I'm sorry that I tricked you into that. Now, I personally don't like to do surveys. I don't have the patience, but I love to read the results of surveys because they oftentimes give us really valuable insight. And one survey that we all need to be paying attention to is from the Barna Foundation. This was about 10 years ago, but I would be surprised if the data differed that much today. But of young people that are in a typical youth group in a church, the data indicates that about just over half, will pursue some kind of career in STEM, science, technology, engineering, medicine, or mathematics. And the reason why is because these are where the lucrative careers are. These are where the exciting things are happening. So it's not surprising that young people in the church want to take part in these areas. But we also see from Barna data that indicates that one of the leading reasons, not the number one reason, but one of the leading reasons why young people walk away from their faith has to do with issues involving science, right? It has to do with issues involving science. And other survey data, I don't have the specific numbers at my fingertips, indicate that most youth pastors don't talk about science faith issues. Most pastors don't really talk about these issues either, right? And so we're in a really concerning situation where young people, these are going to be people that you know, maybe you are included, want to pursue a career in STEM. They're going to be taking courses in science and technology, but somehow they get the idea that science is a threat for their faith, and that motivates them to the point where they walk away from their faith. Now, maybe some come back later, but this is, again, concerning. And then on top of that, there's results from a Pew Research survey, Pew Research Foundation survey, where they asked the question, how many people who think there's conflict between science and faith, right? Do you think there's conflict between science and faith? And about 72% of people who never attend church or seldom attend church say the answer is yes. Okay, that doesn't surprise me because sadly we live in a world where people equate science with truth. And if you think that science and Christianity are at odds with each other and science is true, then Christianity must not be true. That's how people reason. But what really troubles me is the fact that 50% of people that attend church on a weekly basis have this idea that science and faith are in conflict. So when you put all of this together, and I know this also from my own experience, the church can be a rather hostile place towards science, where people see science as a threat to the faith, they see scientists as enemies to the faith. Young people grow up in a church where this is in the backdrop. They're interested in going into careers in science, and then they leave the church and they're confronted with data and information that they never have been exposed to and have no idea how to process that and walk away from their faith. Right? So this is serious business that again, not everybody is a scientist, I get that. Not everybody is going to gravitate towards apologetics, but you should at least be aware of how to respond to some questions and objections that people have. Now, here's a picture of a crocodile with a little bird in its mouth. Right, this is an Egyptian plover. And the anecdotal evidence is that this bird will fly into the open mouth of a crocodile and pick away at the debris in the crocodile's teeth. Right? That's how the bird feeds. Now, you can imagine this isn't probably the best way to earn a living, right? Because what happens if the crocodile gets bored with this arrangement, right? Closes its mouth and a nice snack, end of the Egyptian plover. Well, this is how a lot of people see the relationship today between science and religion, and Christianity in particular, is that Christianity is just this based on superstition. It's an outmoded idea, right? And that science is what's going to win the day. And that right now, people in the scientific world tolerate religious ideas, but eventually it's all going to come to an end. This is how Alistair McGrath describes it in his book, The Twilight of Atheism. One of the most remarkable developments of the 19th and early 20th centuries has been the relentless advance of the perception that there exists a permanent essential conflict between the natural sciences and religion. Science is at war with religion, and that war can only lead to the elimination of religious belief as a relic of a superstitious age that is now long behind us. Science proves things, whereas religion depends on the authoritarian imposition of its dogmas, which fly in the face of evidence. To take the idea of God seriously is to commit intellectual suicide. Scientists are the Promethean liberators of humanity from their bondage to religious tradition and superstition. So this is, again, the milieu that we find ourselves in. And it's remarkable to me how prevalent that mindset is that McGrath described, that science and faith are in conflict with each other. It is a common narrative, not only in our culture here in the U.S., but around the world. It's a common narrative. So what we're doing this next few days is responding to this. We're going to be responding to this narrative and showing the opposite is the case, that the evidence from science provides powerful reasons to believe that there is a God, not just a God, but the God of the Bible, who is responsible for the origin of the universe and the origin of life. That the creation accounts in Scripture are credible, that they are reliable, and as a result of that, we can put confidence in the message of the Bible. That's what we're going to be focusing on. But before we do that, we need to talk a little bit about what is science. I don't know if any of you have ever thought about that question. Probably not, because you're young, healthy people, right? And this is the type of question that philosophers will ask and then spend centuries arguing about, which is very much the case, right? But this is actually important because when we ask this question, we're going to see one of the reasons why people have this perception that there's conflict between science and faith, right? We'll get some insight into what is the source of that conflict. Now, how would you answer that question if I ask you, what is science?
How things work.
How things work. Okay, that's not bad. Isaac.
I'm pretty sure science class had you define it as the study of how things work and what things do in order to predict what will happen in the future.
Okay, not bad, not bad. Yeah. Anybody else want to venture a guess? Okay. Well, one definition of science is these are the facts about nature, right? That we're learning how things work, why are things the way they are in the world that we live in, right? There's another definition of science, and it's the methodology used to gain information, right? And you guys are familiar with the scientific method, right? You guys, right? You make observations, you do experiments, you get results, you develop a hypothesis, it makes predictions, and then you do another round of observations or experiments, and you determine were the predictions from that hypothesis valid or not, and if they were, hey, maybe there's something to this hypothesis. If not, either you scrap it or you revise it, right? That's the scientific method. And I would say as a scientist, I'm a biochemist by training, as a scientist, the methodology of science is really what defines it, right? That's the most important thing. This is the reason why we can be confident, or reasonably confident, that science is giving us facts about nature, is because we're using a disciplined method to make sure that what we learn is indeed valid. And of course, again, we just talked about this. This is the methodology of science. Now, there's another way that people think about science, and this is where the problems arise. That they argue that science isn't so much about the facts of nature or the method, it really is a philosophy about how we go about studying the world, right? And it's called methodological naturalism, right? There's a word that you can use to impress your parents. When you talk to them on the phone, you can say, we were talking about methodological naturalism, and they're going to feel like they're getting their money's worth sending you here, right? Well, that's a term that's not that difficult in terms of the concept it represents. And to understand methodological naturalism, we need to understand something called philosophical naturalism. Does anybody know what that means? What would you guess that means if you don't know? Okay. Well, what it means, what philosophical naturalism means, is atheism, right? That you have this philosophical commitment to a view of the world in which God does not exist. There is no supernatural, there is no God, there's nothing beyond the universe. It's just that the physical, material universe is all that there is. Right? As Carl Sagan, the late Carl Sagan, who was an astronomer and an atheist, said, the universe is all that there was, is, and ever will be. That's philosophical naturalism. Sometimes it's called materialism or naturalism, atheism. Those are, in effect, equivalent terms. Right? Methodological naturalism is this idea that when you engage in the operation of science, you function as if you are an atheist, right? That, in other words, what you only are allowed to pursue explanations for the universe or any phenomena in the universe that involves materialistic, mechanistic processes. You cannot appeal to divine agency. You cannot appeal to a creator or a creator's handiwork to describe anything within nature. It's got to be materialistic alone, right? Now, people that advocate for methodological naturalism says, well, this view is neutral on whether God exists or not. You can believe in God or you can reject God, but either way, you operate according to this framework, right? Now, that makes science inherently atheistic in nature. It makes science inherently atheistic in nature, right? Because that's the lowest common denominator. You're functioning as if God does not exist. And a lot of times what I see happen is people embrace methodological naturalism as the way science operates, and it bleeds over into espousing a type of atheism, whether they realize it or not. I've interacted with a number of scientists who are non-believers, and I'll ask them, it's like, do you believe that God exists? And they will say, I don't know, I've never thought about it, right? I guess I must be an atheist because I'm a scientist. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that statement. But what happens is when you say that you don't need to appeal to the work of an intelligent agent to explain anything in the universe, right? What that basically means is that science is never going to provide evidence for God, and any evidence that you present from science for God, people are going to say that's out of bounds, that's outside the realm of science, right? So again, this is one reason why many people see conflict between science and faith, is because science can explain everything. I don't need to God, I don't have need for that hypothesis, as Laplace, the famous mathematician in France, said to Napoleon when Napoleon asked him about where is God in his mathematical work. And he said, I don't have need for that hypothesis. That's he's espousing methodological naturalism. This is what Richard Lewontin said. I think he may be dead now. I'm not positive. If he's not dead, he's quite old. But he was a famous evolutionary biologist at Harvard University. And this is what he said. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute. We cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Now, can somebody tell me what you heard when I read that quote? Yes.
Basically, like, when you're talking about science, you can't look at, you have to, like, there can't really be any mention of God at all.
Yeah.
It has to be all about the facts and
Mhm.
no like feelings or like,
Right.
you know, like I said, a divine foot in the door. It has to just be, you know, strictly science and no agenda, no
Yeah.
even mention of God.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
They're seeking, they're seeking conclusions based on a previous belief they had, instead of making conclusions and then choosing their beliefs afterwards. They're
Yes.
just trying to prove a point they've already decided.
That's very good. Very good. Yes.
I kind of go that that by their study of the world and of science, that there is a lot of evidence for a creator and for like something beyond just the material things, but that it's like a prerequisite that you're not able to involve that
Right.
as a reasoning for
Right. Right.
the things that don't make sense. Like,
Right. So this is good. This is good. So if I am looking at, let's say, the origin of life, and I'm looking at all these different evolutionary explanations, and none of them work, and yet at the same time I see design in the cell, I see, other reasons to think that there is a God, like we'll talk about this, like the universe has a beginning or there's design in the universe. I can't even advance the idea that maybe the origin of life is the handiwork of a creator. I can't even entertain that. Instead, I've got to develop a different explanation, right? I have to develop a different explanation, one that somehow insists upon evolutionary processes, whether that's what the data says or not, because any alternative is out of bounds, right? Right. So this is part of the reason why people see science as being in opposition to Christianity. It's for philosophical reasons and philosophical commitments that really are that. They're philosophical commitments. It's not what the evidence is pointing to. Right? So that's a really important point, that if you leave, if after a week that's the only thing you remember, I will feel like my time here was well spent, if you remember that point. Yes?
Can you say it one more time? I think I missed it.
Okay.
I got it and then I was like, okay.
Yeah. All right. So in other words, when you engage in science, you're functioning as if God does not exist, right? And you're only pursuing materialistic, mechanistic explanations. And this is a philosophical commitment that you've made ahead of time about how you're going to draw conclusions from the data. And when the data comes in, even if the data is telling you that none of these evolutionary processes work, there's evidence for design, there's all these pointers to the work of a creator in nature, those cannot be considered to be valid explanations scientifically. They're just simply off the table. So you're only left with evolutionary explanations, whether they work or not. Rick?
A simple way to put it is, you get a loaf of bread, you have to decide how the loaf of bread got there, but you can never, ever suggest somebody might have baked the bread.
Yes.
So, maybe not right now, there's time for questions. I don't know.
You can ask the question. Go ahead.
I just, maybe I'm missing the point of what do we do with, like, as a, if I'm like, are you telling me to, like, go, like, look at science through that lens, or?
I'm telling you not to look through
Okay.
through that lens. But what I'm doing is I'm telling you how how people that are working in science often think about it, even Christians, by the way. some of the most vehement arguments I've had about this are with Christians who work in science, right? Which to me is very disappointing, right? We can unpack why that is. But what I'm trying to do is get you to understand how people think about this. And as Rick said, that's a great example. The net effect is you've got a loaf of bread, and any explanation for how that loaf of bread got there is perfectly fine as long as it doesn't involve somebody baking it. And you can understand how ridiculous that is, right? But that is the issue that you're dealing with. And because people then don't appreciate that influence of methodological naturalism, they'll say, well, science has demonstrated there is no God. Well, it hasn't demonstrated there's no God. It just simply won't even allow God as an explanation, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Good. I'm glad you asked that question. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a very different perspective on science, where I'm actually going to make the case from a philosophical standpoint that if you do not have a worldview that looks like the Christian worldview, technically science is impossible. So here's the irony, right, is people through methodological naturalism try to exclude God from science, but the fact of the matter is if it wasn't for the Christian faith, science wouldn't even exist as a discipline. Right? So this is the point that I'm going to make. Does anybody in here know what a worldview is? Well, yeah. Could somebody tell me what? Well, you answered the question. You said you know what it is, but could somebody tell me what a worldview is?
Set of beliefs that help orchestrate how you live your life,
Yeah.
and how you look at things, and how you understand how things work.
Yeah, great. It's a set of beliefs that, again, that as you said, or you can think of it as a set of answers to fundamental questions, and how you answer those questions creates a perspective on the world that you interpret or understand everything. Very good, very good. So what do I mean by that? Well, think about this. You'd never just go out and start doing science. You've got to believe certain things are true in order to do science. Like you have to believe, for example, that the universe is real, right? If you take an Eastern perspective on the world, where you say that the world is an illusion, right? It's not real, it's an illusion. Well, then what's the point of doing science, right? Because you're studying something that's an illusion. And what may be an illusion for me may be a different illusion for you. So can we even know anything about our illusion? So you've got to assume that the universe is real and that it's actually good and valuable and worth studying. That there's a reason to study the world, to understand the world, that's valuable information to have. We also have to assume that the laws of nature are orderly. They display order, there's a pattern, there's a regularity to them, right? And that the laws of nature are the same throughout the universe. Right? Think about that, because if that wasn't the case, then what I've learned today about the universe may not be true tomorrow. And what I learned today may not have been the way it was yesterday, or what I learned about the universe here may not be true someplace else. And so if these are not something that you assume to be true, there's no way to do science. We also have to believe that the universe is intelligible, that we can actually study the universe and make sense of the universe, that it's structured in a way that is accessible to us, and that as human beings we have the ability to truly understand the way the universe is, right? These may seem obvious, but these are critical assumptions that everybody makes when they engage in science. And so then the question becomes, what worldview actually gives you these preconditions, right? Christianity does, right? Because in Christianity, we believe that the universe is real, that God created it, but that the universe is actually a real thing that exists independent of God, but emanates from God. It's part of God's creation, right? We believe that God is revealed in nature, and we'll talk more about this in the next hour. But as Christians, we believe that God is revealed in nature. So that in and of itself means it's valuable to study nature. Because by studying nature, we're going to see God revealed in the creation. And as Christians, we want to know God. We want to know more about God. And so the creation is a means by which we can do that. And studying creation is part of that. That God is a God of order and regularity. This is Jeremiah 33. Talks about a regularity to the laws of nature that God has instituted. And that in Jeremiah 33, it's that God is trustworthy because what he has made proceeds with regularity and with order. God is a God of order, which is necessary, again, for us to be able to be confident that what's going to be true tomorrow about the universe is true today. And that there's this idea of providence, that God provides for that which he has made, and that provision for us is within the creation itself, that we can get material and knowledge and insight from creation and use that to promote human flourishing. And so that motivates us to study science. Or we are to love our neighbor as ourselves, right? And that means that we want to understand the human body so that we can help treat people who suffer from illnesses or injuries or diseases. That we are made in God's image, and because we're made in his image, the universe is intelligible to us because God has revealed himself to us through the universe. So studying the universe is going to be accessible to us. But as image bearers, we are made with the mental machinery to make sense of the world. We also have dominion over creation. We are to be rulers of creation, which means that we can study the world and take what we learn from the world and use it, not only for our benefit, but to be stewards of the planet. So, in other words, Christianity, with the worldview connected to Christianity, gives us the preconditions for science to be possible. And it's no accident, by the way, that modern science was actually birthed in Western Europe at the time of the Protestant Reformation. And there's a number of reasons why that's the case. Science was actually emerged in a number of different civilizations very early on in human history, but it basically died out. It wasn't able to flourish. Even in the Dark Ages, the so-called Dark Ages, there was science that was underway that was really motivated and sponsored by the church at that time. But it was like a slow fuse. But when the Protestant Reformation hit, there was an explosion, and out of that emerged modern science. And it's because the Christian worldview lent itself to essentially the principles that you would need to be in place in order for science to flourish. So the point here is that the irony, again, when you think about methodological naturalism, where people try to use that to argue that somehow God should be excluded from science, is ironic, because if it wasn't for the Christian faith and a recognition that God is revealed to us through creation, and that by studying creation we're thinking God's thoughts after him, that science itself would never have been born, right? And so if you hold to naturalism, to philosophical naturalism, you've got a problem, right? Because why would you think that the universe should display order and regularity? Why shouldn't it be a chaotic universe? There's nothing in naturalism that would tell us this is how we would expect the universe to be. Why should we trust our senses as human beings, right, in a naturalistic framework. And this was actually something that kept Darwin awake at night, because Darwin advocated this idea that humans are the product of evolution. But if we're the product of evolution, then our minds are not evolved to tell the truth about the world or discover the truth about the world. Our minds are structured so that we survive. And so Darwin said, with me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind? So in other words, when an atheist is doing science, they're actually stealing the Christian worldview in order to put in place the preconditions needed for science, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you guys? Okay, this is another really important point, right? That you should walk away from here with, and that is Christianity birthed science. The worldview that comes out of Christianity laid the foundation for the explosion of modern science. I wouldn't say the birth, but the explosion of modern science. And that inherently Christianity can never be in opposition to science. Inherently, that can never be the case. And then just to kind of close things out here, when you look at the history of science, some of the people that were critical in establishing modern science and were the fathers of different scientific disciplines were committed, devout Christians who were driven to do their work as scientists because of their faith as Christians. They saw science as a deeply theological activity. And so this is just a list of some of the pioneers in science who were Christians, including Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton actually wrote more on theology than he did on physics and mathematics, believe it or not. And then, of course, Louis Pasteur, who's one of my favorite scientists. Okay, let's see here. Any other questions? I'm just going to see what time it is. Any comments, any thoughts?
How does the secular world receive you guys? Secular scientific community.
Generally speaking, the question is, how does the secular scientific community receive us? Generally speaking, they would agree that our discussion of the science is sound, that even our critiques of some of the ideas in evolutionary theory are valid. They just don't like the theological conclusions that we draw. That's generally the case. So, yes?
How often do you get a good response to the way that you guys say? People are like, oh, I've never thought about it that way, or like, maybe this does have value to our conversation.
Yeah, I would say that generally speaking, the response is it's mixed, right? For people that are Christians, a lot of times it's a very positive response because, hey, this is something I can use to engage non-believers. They immediately see value in it. Some people are like, wow, I never saw things this way, and now they're suddenly really encouraged in their faith. And a lot of times those people tend to become very enthusiastic about sharing their faith after that experience, right? There are people that are non-believers that are moved to our position, right, to embrace the Christian faith. And then there's people that are just simply naysayers. So it's across the board. But, you know, I don't know that I've got statistics or anything like that, but I can tell you that there is letter after letter after letter, email after email after email that I've seen over 25 years just describing the impact that we've had on people. You know, either moving them to the gospel or just really strengthening their faith or rescuing people who are about to give up on their faith. Yeah. Yes?
Have Christian scientists and maybe naturalistic scientists been butting heads for forever? Would Isaac Newton, if Isaac Newton was alive today, would he be having would people be doubting him because of his religious background, or was there a switch that flipped when maybe the theory of evolution was introduced, where people were then started kind of doubting when someone would bring faith into science? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yeah, that's an interesting thought experiment. How would Isaac Newton be received today? Right? I mean, in his day, what he was doing was commonplace. And you even see that up into the mid-1800s, where people really saw science in theological terms. And there was a lot of religious language that were used in scientific publications. And it seemed as if the tide switched with Darwin, where Darwin's whole motivation behind his theory of evolution was theological. Darwin was deeply troubled by the problem of evil. Right? One of his daughters, who was 10 years old, died, and that really caused him deep problems about how could God allow this to happen. And when he looked at nature, he saw nature red in tooth and claw. He just saw brutality in nature, and just couldn't believe that there was a God that was responsible for this. And so, as a result of that, he was working on the problem, how do you explain the origin of species, and then took that idea and essentially extended it to be a wholesale explanation for all of biology, where he replaced the mind of a creator with the mechanism of evolution. And it seemed like when that happened, and suddenly evolution became anti-teleological. Teleology means design and purpose. It became contrary to any kind of fundamental design or purpose to the living realm. It seemed like the rest of science went along with them. Because even prior to Darwin, people were looking at mechanistic explanations for the world, but they saw God behind those mechanisms. With Darwin, it felt like the tide switched, and suddenly there was no meaning or purpose, and that really carried, into the much of the first part of the 1900s. And it seemed like probably in the 90s, 80s and 90s, in astronomy things started to change, where people were making discoveries that really suggested that there very well may be a meaning or a purpose or a design to the universe. And since then, you're starting to see biologists come around to that idea more and more.
Would you say the pendulum's swinging backwards? It was from Darwin, it's kind of swung more to
Yep.
the anti-theological.
Yep.
Would you say it's swinging backwards right now, or do you think it's still?
No, I think it's still going in that direction. There are some versions of evolutionary theory that are being advanced that are deeply teleological. They're deeply filled with purpose. It's a very interesting idea that's starting to emerge, that there actually could be a fundamental design to biology that seems to be pre-sculpted into the very fabric of the universe, and that what happens has been predetermined, that evolutionary outcomes are predetermined ahead of time, which is completely different than how people have seen evolution for almost 175 years. So you're starting to see, even among evolutionary biologists, a sense of purpose. Or there's this idea in anthropology now of human exceptionalism, where it used to be, for, again, 150 years, starting with Darwin, people just saying there's nothing special about human beings, we're just part of this evolutionary network of life, and that we only differ in degree, not kind, from other creatures. And now there's a growing group of anthropologists who are not believers, who are saying, wait a minute, there seems to be something special about human beings. So I could go on a university campus and I could make an argument scientifically for human exceptionalism, and connect it to the image of God, and they would be atheists in anthropology who would not be troubled by what I was doing. So you're starting to see the pendulum swing. Or there are origin of life researchers who are now saying, we have no clue how life originates, right? We have no clue how it originates. And some of the ideas that are starting to pop up are really, you're right there in this whole arena of design and purpose. Rick?
Didn't the Big Bang, wasn't that sort of the turning point for a lot of people where
Yep.
before that you could roll the dice a chance as many times as you wanted to
Yep.
get, but all of a sudden the Big Bang had a finite
Yep.
starting point.
Yep.
And that calls into question all the rest of the stuff that
Yep.
Calvert had to do the multiverse, just try to get away from it.
Yep. And then that coupled with the fine-tuning of the constants of physics, those two things were really the turning point.
What are some of the arguments for human exceptionalism?
We probably won't talk about it. So basically, human beings have certain capabilities that no other animal has, or certain combinations of capabilities that no other animal has. One of them is symbolism, that we can represent the world with symbols. And then we can manipulate and combine and recombine the symbols, and that allows us to tell stories, right? And so, so language, music, and art are all manifestations of symbolism. We also have theory of mind, where we recognize others have minds like ours, and that we have this desire to connect our minds together, right? And we do that in a way that in which we create these very complex social structures. We also have the ability to do what's called mental time travel, where we can go back into the past and think about what happened and then create alternate scenarios and determine how the outcome might have been different. We can go into the future and we can actually imagine what the future would look like given how we might make decisions now, and actually then work towards creating a future of our own making, right? We can create goals and move towards those goals, right? And that allows us to do a unique type of problem solving that no other creature can, and it's intertwined with our ability for symbolism and theory of mind. But it's that combination of qualities that humans have that no other creature has, right, that causes us to stand apart. And so the comparison would be, well, you look at chimpanzees, they're about to go extinct, right? Now this is in that humans we've put people on the moon, right? And well, what's the difference? Because from an evolutionary perspective, we started from the same ancestral group, and there are two lineages. Chimps are going extinct. We're dominating the planet with our technology. Why? There's got to be something that's different about us. Or even like with Neanderthals. A lot of people say, well, Neanderthals are just like us. Well, if you look at their technology, it didn't change over the duration of their time on Earth. On the other hand, we start off with primitive technology, and again, in a relatively short period of time, we've put people on the moon, right? And so there's got to be something different about us, and when people try to work through that, it's things like symbolism, theory of mind, mental time travel. Those are the qualities that seem to, and if you think about those qualities, you can make an argument that those are scientific descriptors of what we would understand to be the image of God. But nevertheless, it's absolutely significant to say that humans are exceptional. I mean, that is mind-blowing to me. I've been doing this 25 years ago, and in the last half decade or so, suddenly you start seeing this concept of human exceptionalism gain credibility, which is amazing to me. I think that's going to be equivalent to the Big Bang. You know, as Rick is saying, hey, you got a beginning to the universe, and we'll talk more about that. There's got to be a beginner. If humans are exceptional and you can show this connects to the image of God, the universe has a beginning, there must be a creator, and humans are exceptional like the Bible describes, I think everything else will become interesting conversation. Yeah, so, yes.
In science and mathematics, there's like, the concept of infinity, like with the rational numbers, and even things like the numbers of pi or the Mandelbrot fractal, infinity exists. And I've heard the argument that since there's infinity in a finite world, that's a proof for God. Can I hear your opinion on that? I don't know a lot about that. I just want to know if that's a sound argument or not.
It might be a sound argument. I don't know that I would say I understand the argument or understand it enough to know if it is a good argument or not. I've heard conversations with people about that, and part of the issue is the way mathematicians and scientists think about infinity is not necessarily the same way philosophers think about infinity. Because philosophers will tell you absolute infinites are impossible. Mathematicians and physicists will tell you infinities are impossible, are possible. And I think they're defining it differently, but it's a very complicated discussion. And to be frank, I don't follow it. It's deeply, deeply philosophical and mathematical, beyond my capabilities to make sense of it. So I'm not saying it's not a good argument, but it's a very difficult arena that you're walking into. There's some things, or the whole concept of time. You would not believe how complex that issue is from a philosophical standpoint. Yes, ma'am.
So I don't really know, but there's like, from what I've seen, there's a lot of consistencies in science, and like scientific theories though don't have a lot of consistency, like over time and stuff. They're all changing, and there's new ideas, like you're saying. And so, is it not like I don't really even know, but like, is it not concerning to these scientists that deny God that there is consistency and there has been consistency for so long that comes from this Christian viewpoint, but then science itself, which is supposed to be based off of facts, is constantly changing, and like these theories that they have that are all man-made are all different. Is that like, do these scientists just like ignore the fact that they have these new theories every like however many years? Like,
Yeah, you're asking a really good question. And I mean, because the point that you're making is all ideas in science are provisional, which means this is what we think is true today, but it's not that theories are constantly changing, it's that as you get new facts, you're forced sometimes to revise a theory, right, to accommodate those facts, or they're showing you there was a problem with the theory that needs to be corrected. So things are definitely provisional in science, right? And so, it's odd to me that in light of that, there are times where scientists will draw very hard lines in the sand on certain issues in light of that provisional nature. I mean, I can tell you one example. It's junk DNA, right? When I started at Reasons to Believe, everybody thought most of the human genome was made up of non-functional junk DNA that was the vestige of this evolutionary history. And we went on record at that time saying it's our conviction that we'll discover function for all of what's considered to be junk. Well, here we are 25 years later, and people have given up on the concept of junk DNA. It's like most of the genome is functional. That is the strong consensus, right? And the design implications of that are huge, right? It's absolutely huge, right? So that's an example of how provisional things are. But the line that people draw in the sand is very, very hard. In light of the evidence, that the genome is most of it's functional, or if not all of it, there are evolutionary biologists who are saying these results can't be correct. Because if these results are correct, it means key ideas in evolutionary theory are wrong, right? And so they're drawing a really hard line, and they're not accepting that provisional nature. So it surprises me, but it's absolutely right. Now, one thing that we've got to be careful about too, though, is recognizing that provisional nature. When we use science to make a case for Christianity, we want to be careful that we're not just chasing the latest fad, that we really want to sit back and say, what are the trend line? Where is this going, right? And so that's part of the art of this. The idea of the Big Bang was proposed in the early 1900s. Today, I don't think anybody would question whether the Big Bang describes the universe. It's pretty much a universal among astronomers. But it was a battle for well over a century as to whether or not the Big Bang model was valid. But if you're monitoring that and you've got some understanding of the science, there's going to be a point where you're saying, yeah, there still may be some questions, but this is where it's all going. This is where it's all heading, right? And so there's an art to that as an apologist, But we probably should take a break, right? So I don't even know what time it is here. Okay, so why don't we take 10 minutes and then we'll come back and we'll do the next section. And I'm around, so you can ask me questions.